As a children's literature professor, I read children's literature for research and teaching purposes as well as for leisure. So today I am going to give you a wrap-up of what I've read this year so far, but I'm going to rank each book according to whether I would teach it, research it, or simply read it for leisure. By giving a book a teaching ranking, I'm essentially saying that I would read this book over and over and over again. Sometimes that's 5 or 6 times, depending on how many times I end up teaching it over the course of the few years as a part of my undergraduate curriculum. If I give a novel a research ranking, that means the novel has pivotal themes that I want to explore and germinate on for a while, in order to eventually write about it for a scholarly publication or presentation. And if a novel gets a leisure ranking, as you can imagine, that means I enjoyed the book and I would probably recommend it to a friend, but most likely wouldn't have a reason to read it multiple times. And at the end of today's video, I will be sharing which books were my overall favorites. Let's go! Amina's Voice by Hina Khan centers on the daily struggles of 6th grader Amina Khokar, a Pakistani-American Muslim girl. One of Amina's struggles is the changing dynamics between her and her best friend Sujin, and that major shift is occurring at the same time of her second major struggle, which is her uncle moving from Pakistan to live with her and her family. Essentially, Amina is having a difficult time adjusting to the changes in her friendships as well as in her family dynamics. I originally read this text in order to teach it in my girlhood studies class. However, I couldn't figure out where in the trajectory of my curriculum that this book would fit. I always start off my course by teaching Mercy Suarez Changes Gears by Meg Medina, and I feel that Amina's Voice would fit in with how I teach Mercy Suarez. But that means I would be using 2 novels to explore the same themes, and that would be redundant. And since I'm not ready to swap out Mercy Suarez Changes Gears from my curriculum just yet, I'm going to give Amina's Voice a leisure ranking until I am able to figure out how to add it to my curriculum in the upcoming years. Stand Up Yumi Chung by Jessica Kim is about 11-year-old Yumi Chung who desperately wants to become a stand-up comedian. But of course, her parents won't even entertain the thought. They want her to focus on her schoolwork because in the Chung family, a good education is the foundation for success. I originally read Stand Up Yumi Chung over a year ago when I first met Jessica Kim at the San Diego Writers Festival. I was intrigued by the novel's premise and of course wanted to read it. So while I started originally reading it for leisure, I quickly realized how it touched upon some of the additional themes that I teach in my girlhood studies course. And that's when I realized that I actually wanted to teach it and not just read it for leisure. So this fall, I'm actually going to be teaching Stand Up Yumi Chung for the first time in my undergraduate course. So what started off as a leisurely read soon turned into what I felt like could be some really great teachable moments in the classroom. Thus, Stand Up Yumi Chung gets a teaching ranking. Maisie Chen's Last Chance by Lisa Yee is a Newbery Award winner honor that centers on the summer adventures of protagonist Macy as she goes to visit her grandparents in Last Chance, Minnesota for the first time. There, she learns about her family's immigration from China, as well as the stories of the many paper sons that her great-grandfather helped to assimilate into U.S. society. Like Amina's Voice, I read Maisie Chen's Last Chance in order to see if I would be able to teach it in my undergraduate classroom. But since the focus of the narrative is on the history of the paper sons, finding a way to link that to girlhood, which is the focus of my class, was too difficult. So as a result, I am giving Maisie Chen's Last Chance a leisure ranking. Brother's Keeper by Julie Lee is a historical fiction novel that takes place during the Korean War. The novel's protagonist is 12-year-old Sora, who is fighting to save her and her brother's life as they escape from North to South Korea. Brother's Keeper is another book that I thought that I would just be reading for leisure purposes, with potentially the thought of adding it to my curriculum. But as soon as I started reading it, I thought to myself, I have to teach this book. Since changing my curriculum does take time, I don't plan on adding it to my course for another year or 2. But either way, that means Brother's Keeper turned from a leisurely read to now a teaching read. The To All the Boys I've Loved Before series by Jenny Han is a popular YA romance trilogy turned Netflix adaptation that follows the romantic adventures of Laura Jean Song Covey as she falls in love for the first time. Technically, I read all 3 books as a part of a research project that I was doing on popular representations of biracial Asian American girlhood in US media. But since finishing the trilogy, I've actually decided to put that research project on hold. So even though the trilogy started off with a research ranking, I'm going to switch that to a leisurely ranking until I decide whether I'm going to pick up this research project again. Either way, it was a fun leisurely read, and if you love young adult romance, I highly recommend. The Summer I Turned Pretty trilogy, also by Jenny Han, is another YA romance trilogy turned Hulu adaptation that follows Belly Conklin as she pines after her first love, Conrad Fisher, while discovering herself along the way. The trilogy also started off as a part of that biracial Asian American girlhood research project until I got to the end of book 1, only to realize that Belly is not Asian American in the novels, which would then throw a huge wrench into the argument that I was trying to develop. Belly is actually raced white in the novels, even though she is raced as Asian American in the adaptation, which would then mean I would need to be watching the adaptation in addition to discussing the race politics in the novel, and that felt like way too much labor for one article. I may continue this article later on, but for now, the Summer I Turned Pretty trilogy gets a leisure ranking. Once Upon a K-Prom by Kat Cho is a K-pop inspired young adult novel about high schooler Elena Sue, who is trying to save the local community center. And she's trying to do this by convincing her peers to not spend as much on prom so that they can take some of those funds and donate it to the community center. And as you can imagine, this is not winning her any popularity points. That is until, I'm just smiling thinking about it. That is until her best friend and K-pop star, Robbie, swoops in and saves the day. But of course, chaos ensues. I know that I could never get away with teaching Once Upon a K-Prom in my English literature undergraduate course, even though the thought has crossed my mind. But as a whole, Once Upon a K-Prom was a really sweet leisure read. Color Me In by Natasha Diaz follows 16-year-old Nevaeh Levitt, who is caught between the messy divorce and cultural expectations of her Jewish father and Black mother. As a result, Nevaeh has to sort through where she feels she belongs culturally, how she wants to identify, in addition to learning how to be a good family member and daughter, as well as a good friend. It was actually the cover that had attracted me to this book, which then led me to read the synopsis, which then made me want to read the novel, and perhaps add it to my course curriculum. But while reading it, I realized that I didn't actually want to teach it, but rather add it as a primary source to an article that I'm currently writing. So Color Me In gets a research ranking. And I should say it's not that I wouldn't want to teach it, it's that I want to publish the article first in order to be able to use the article alongside the novel for when I actually can bring it into my undergraduate curriculum. So I am looking forward to being able to do that in the next few years. EXO, oh, 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 oh. EXO, oh, 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 oh. XOXO by Axie-O is another swoon-worthy K-pop romance centered on Jinny, who is a cellist prodigy, and Jae-woo, who is the leader of a top major K-pop group. They haphazardly meet one night in LA, and of course, romance ensues. Again, there is no way that I would be able to teach this in my undergraduate curriculum. I mean, let me think about this. My course is generally focused on things like identity, cultural expectations, race, and gender. But I think because this novel is so swoon-worthy, it would take a lot of weeding through the romance in order to get to the themes that my class touches upon. So I'm not opposed to teaching it. I think in the future, if I was able to do a class on the constructions of romance and young adult literature, this book would be perfect for that. But until then, I am giving a leisure ranking. Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell is about a fan fiction writer named Kath. And Kath is obsessed with the fictional Simon Snow series. And through her writing, she explores love and communication and desire. Things she doesn't feel like she has access to in her real life. Fangirl is definitely a leisure read, even though technically I was reading it for personal research purposes. I had originally read Eleanor and Park, and I was really curious to see the voice difference and how Rowell had developed Eleanor versus how she had developed Kath. And I have to say that I was actually pleasantly surprised in how differently each of these characters are voiced in the novels. I think it might be interesting thinking more about that and also thinking about how Rowell has been a staple in the YA industry and potentially turning that into a research paper. But I'm not sure that I want to start reading Rowell's work in order to think about it critically. I think I would rather keep reading her work in order to just enjoy it. So with that, I am giving Fangirl a leisure ranking. Speaking of Eleanor and Park, also by Rainbow Rowell, it is a New York Times bestseller that centers on the romantic relationship of Eleanor and Park. Eleanor and Park are two high school outcasts, and it is through their pariah status that they end up developing a friendship that eventually turns romantic. In one of my children's literature course, I had assigned an article from a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Virginia Lohagan, and Dr. Lohagan talks about Eleanor and Park in her article. It was actually after class that day that we had discussed it. One of my students came up to me and asked me about my thoughts on Eleanor and Park because she was reading it for a different class. And since I hadn't read it yet, I wanted to engage with her about the novel, so that's when I bought it and read it. I then became really curious about the discourse around Eleanor and Park, and so of course I took to the internet to see what other people had also thought about the novel as well. That's when I saw how divisive the novel really is, which then of course made me think this could be a really great book to teach in my course. But because the novel is also very divisive, I knew I would have to be really careful in how I taught it. But for now, until I can figure that out, I'm going to give Eleanor and Park a leisure ranking. And feel free to comment below to let me know whether you've read Eleanor and Park. I would love to hear your thoughts about it as well. Frankly in Love by David Yoon draws upon the fake dating trope. Frankly, which is a play on the title, is a Korean-American high schooler who is dating Britt Means. The thing is, Britt Means is not Korean-American. She is white. And for Frank's parents, that is an absolute no-no. So Frank concocts a fake dating scheme with one of his childhood friends who is also Korean American and is also in a forbidden relationship. However, in the course of their fake dating scheme, they eventually fall in love. And of course, chaos ensues. As you may or may not know, I am actually a fan of Nicola Yoon's work, and so I was super curious about her husband's writing. The thing is, because I'm so focused on girlhood in terms of what I teach and what I research, I do not often read novels from a male protagonist perspective. Actually, I think that Frankly in Love has been the third book that I've read in the past maybe 2 or 3 years that centers on a boy protagonist. So I am definitely out of my wheelhouse when it came to reading Frankly in Love. But I actually was pleasantly surprised. It was much more engaging than I thought it would be. Again, as someone who rarely ever reads books from a male perspective. I also thought Frank's sense of voice was really strong, as well as the pacing and the romantic tension. And so since Frankly in Love is outside of my curriculum boundaries as well as my research boundaries, I am going to give it a leisure ranking. I Hope This Doesn't Find You by Anne Liang draws upon the academic rivals to lovers trope. It actually reminds me of that Netflix movie Candy Jar about those two high schoolers on the debate team who absolutely hate each other but of course end up falling in love. Except that Sadie Wynn and Julius Gong, who are the protagonists of I Hope This Doesn't Find You, aren't on the debate team. Instead, they are essentially fighting for the valedictorian spot of their high school. I actually saw this book being recommended on Instagram and I thought the cover was absolutely stunning. So I ended up adding it to my 2024 TBR list. From the first chapter, I knew that it was going to be a good read. The thing is, because of its focus on romance and the academic rivals to lovers, I know that this is another book that I could not get away with teaching in my undergraduate literature course. Again, unless I do a course on YA romance. And it would also be difficult to use in my research as well. So with that, I give the novel a leisure ranking. So now it is time for me to reveal to you my top reads thus far. Drum roll, please. For middle grade, I am choosing Brother's Keeper by Julie Lee. This novel made me cry like a baby. It is so gripping, and I think the language and details are so exquisite. It honestly made me an instant fan of Lee's work, so much so that I went out to get the companion book In the Tunnel immediately. Brother's Keeper really is a heart-wrenching read, and even though it is middle grade, I did read reviews from teachers stating that it should be taught more as upper middle grade or younger YA because of the descriptions of death and war. And I highly recommend reading it if you ever need a good cry or if you ever want to read a book that has really beautiful language. As for my favorite YA thus far, I am choosing I Hope This Doesn't Find You by Anne Liang. In all honesty, I am not an enemies to lovers girly.
Forgive me, madam, for taking up so much of your time.
I am a true blue childhood best friends to lovers kind of girl. So much so that I am currently writing a novel about childhood best friends to lovers. But Liang's writing is so smart that I could not put the book down. Not that I'm an expert or anything. But I have to say that I think in terms of her prose, I can definitely see that there was just so much care in crafting every sentence and every paragraph. I actually really look forward to reading more of Liang's work in the future. So that is all that I have for you today. Feel free to comment below if you've read any of these novels. And let me know what you think about my ranking system. Which books would you read for leisure? Which books would you teach? And which books would you research? As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.